My daughter told 180 wedding guests that I killed her mother. She didn't say it in those exact words, of course. She didn't have to. Caroline stood at that magnificent floral-draped podium, wearing a $15,000 Vera Wang dress that shimmered like crushed diamonds under the crystal chandeliers of the Ashworth Estate Country Club, and she looked right at me. She looked right at the man who had raised her, and she told the room that I was a pathetic, broke failure who let her mother die because I didn't have the money to save her. She told them that my beloved Margaret died ashamed of the mediocre man she had married. She told them she was eternally grateful, that her new husband's family had real money, real class, and real ambition, unlike her disappointing father sitting quietly in the back corner. Every single word she spoke was a lie. I sat at table 12, the designated undesirable table tucked away by the swinging kitchen doors. I was flanked by Reginald's half-deaf great-aunt and two distant, socially awkward cousins who had clearly drawn the short straw on the seating chart. I watched my only child destroy 8 years of my silence in a matter of minutes. The Sterlings, her new family, nodded along in synchronized approval from their prime seating at the head table. Their hedge fund friends, investment bankers, and country club acquaintances smirked into their $200 glasses of champagne. Nobody looked at the broken widower in the cheap navy blue suit. Or if they did, they looked with pity, masking their disdain for the man who didn't belong in their elevated world. I didn't react. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my ice water, feeling the cool liquid coat my throat. I set the glass down carefully on the pristine white tablecloth. I kept my breathing even and my expression entirely blank, because Caroline had absolutely no idea that I currently had $33 million sitting in my Chase checking account. She was about to find out, in the most spectacular fashion imaginable, why you never, ever humiliate the quiet guy in the corner. Trust me, you want to stick around to see what happens next. But before we get to the reckoning, before the absolute destruction of her carefully constructed new life, let me tell you how we got here. Let me tell you how my own flesh and blood became a woman so desperately entitled and deeply insecure that she could weaponize her own mother's tragic death for a few cheap social points among the Greenwich elite. My name is Matt Thompson. I am 62 years old. For 30 of those years, I wasn't just some IT guy, which is what Caroline always dismissively told her friends. I was a high-level military contractor specializing in classified, state-of-the-art cyber defense systems for the Department of Defense. It was the kind of grueling, high-stakes work that paid extremely well, but it required top-secret clearance, non-disclosure agreements that threatened federal prison, and absolute, unwavering discretion about your personal wealth. You didn't drive a Ferrari when you were building firewalls for the Pentagon. You drove a Honda and kept your mouth shut. My wife Margaret and I raised Caroline in a modest, unassuming 3-bedroom house in Stamford, Connecticut. We drove sensible, used cars. We shopped at Target for groceries and clothes. We took summer vacations to the crowded beaches of the Jersey Shore, instead of flying first class to the Amalfi Coast or summering in the Hamptons. This wasn't because we couldn't afford better. We could have afforded almost anything we wanted. We lived this way because Margaret, my beautiful grounded Margaret, believed wholeheartedly in teaching our daughter the value of $1. Don't spoil Caroline with wealth, Matt, she would always tell me, her eyes serious but warm. Let her build her character first. Money without character is just a weapon waiting to be fired. Margaret was a kindergarten teacher. She spent 28 years at the exact same elementary school, shaping young minds for a salary of $45,000 a year. She could have quit a dozen times over, especially after my defense contracts started bringing in serious, life-changing money. But she genuinely loved those kids. She said the innocence of her classroom kept her grounded in a world that was entirely too obsessed with status and superficial success. Because of our lifestyle, Caroline never knew we had money. To her, I was just some average guy who worked long hours on boring computer stuff for the government. Mom was just a teacher. In her mind, we were stubbornly middle class, perhaps even lower middle class when she perceived times to be tight. She grew up believing that hard work didn't necessarily equal financial reward, a dangerous seed that would later blossom into deep resentment. Then, in the harsh winter of 2014, everything changed. Our quiet, unassuming life was shattered. Margaret felt a lump in her breast during a routine self-exam. I still remember the exact moment she told me. The air in our small living room seemed to instantly evaporate. The diagnosis was stage 2 invasive ductal carcinoma. It was aggressive. The oncologist, a grim-faced man with tired eyes, sat us down in his sterile office and told us that we had maybe 18 months if we stuck with the standard treatment protocol. But I wasn't accepting. Maybe I wasn't accepting standard. I quietly and systematically liquidated everything. I sold my lucrative shares in 3 promising defense startups I had helped build from the ground up. I cashed out my Pentagon consulting retainer, which was worth over $2.3 million annually. I burned through every single contact, favor, and connection I had made in 30 years of military medicine. We tried everything. We flew down to Johns Hopkins for experimental immunotherapy trials that cost $180,000 per treatment cycle. When that didn't yield the results we wanted, we went to Mass General for cutting-edge proton beam radiation at $95,000 a session. I even flew us to Switzerland for a specialized clinical trial consultation that cost $40,000 just to walk through the clinic's front doors. Caroline watched me write check after agonizing check. She saw our savings account statements lying on the kitchen counter, showing massive, bleeding withdrawals. She watched me sell the Stamford house we had lived in for 15 years, the only home she had ever known, just to pay for treatments that weren't covered by our standard insurance plan. Dad's spending absolutely everything trying to save Mom, she told her college friends on the phone, pacing in our small rental apartment. Her voice wasn't filled with admiration. It was tinged with panic and a growing sense of financial insecurity. She wasn't entirely wrong about the spending. The medical bills totaled a staggering $2.1 million over 24 grueling months. Every single penny came out of our visible accounts. I bled those accounts dry to keep up the facade, to keep Caroline in the dark about the real depth of our resources, just as Margaret had always wanted. But here is the crucial piece of the puzzle that Caroline didn't see. She didn't see the money flowing back in behind the heavy curtain of classified NDAs. 3 months after Margaret's devastating diagnosis, while I was desperately juggling hospital visits and late-night coding sessions, the Pentagon awarded me the largest single contractor cyber defense project in the history of the United States military. The contract was worth $47.5 million over 5 years. It was completely, unequivocally classified. Even my own family couldn't know the slightest detail of the operation or the compensation. 6 months after that, one of the defense startups I had been involved with went public in a massive IPO. My original founder's stake, which I had supposedly sold off to pay for Margaret's treatments, had actually been converted into restricted shares that I legally couldn't touch until after the IPO lockup period expired. When that stock finally hit the open market, those shares skyrocketed. They were suddenly worth $31.2 million. A year later, Northrop Grumman aggressively bought out another tech company I had helped design security protocols for. My original consulting agreement with them included highly lucrative back-end royalties that triggered the moment they reached specific revenue milestones. That single buyout check was for $18.7 million. By the time Margaret tragically entered hospice care in late 2015, I had more liquid money than we had ever dreamed of in our wildest fantasies. I was a ghost millionaire, rich beyond comprehension, but I couldn't tell her. More importantly, I couldn't tell Caroline. The strict Pentagon contracts required absolute, unyielding financial discretion until the primary projects concluded in 2019. If I suddenly started buying mansions and Ferraris, red flags would go up across 3 different federal agencies. So I kept quiet. I focused entirely on Margaret's comfort. Margaret died on January 15, 2016. The winter air was biting and cruel the day she passed. My heart was ripped out of my chest, leaving a hollow, echoing void that I thought would never heal. Caroline was 25 years old. At the funeral, standing in front of our meager gathering of friends and family, she stood up to give the eulogy. I remember gripping the edge of the wooden pew, bracing myself for her words. She talked about how her father had spent absolutely everything trying to save her mother. She talked about how we had lost our beautiful family house, our savings, our entire financial foundation. She painted a tragic, romanticized picture of poverty born from desperate love. But at least, Caroline said, wiping a single perfect tear from her cheek, at least Mom knew exactly how much Dad loved her, even if it cost him his entire future. I let her believe it. I sat in that freezing church, and I let her believe every word of her own narrative. For 8 long, lonely years after Margaret's death, I let Caroline think we were utterly broke. I let her believe that her father was a tragic failure, a man who had peaked in his 40s, and who couldn't even save his own wife, despite spending every last dime he had to his name. She graduated, moved on, and got a job in corporate marketing, making $65,000 a year. She immediately moved into a tiny, overpriced studio apartment in Manhattan that cost $2,800 monthly, nearly her entire take-home pay. She started dating guys who worked in high finance and management consulting, men who wore tailored suits and flashed platinum credit cards, men who made what she considered real money. Meanwhile, I kept up the charade. I kept living exactly like the broken, impoverished man she thought I was. I bought a small, unassuming 2-bedroom condo in Stamford for $180,000 in pure cash, but I specifically told Caroline I was only renting it month to month. I continued to drive that same reliable 2012 Honda Civic that I'd owned for years. I still shopped for my clothes at Target. I ate my solitary dinners at the same cheap local diners. But in the shadows, from behind a veil of untraceable accounts and trusts, I was watching over her. Every month, Caroline's crushing student loan balances mysteriously got smaller. Her exorbitant credit card minimum payments somehow cleared themselves days before they were due. When she desperately needed a hefty security deposit to move into a slightly better apartment on the Upper East Side, an anonymous cashier's check would miraculously appear in her mailbox. She never once questioned the coincidences. She never looked a gift horse in the mouth. She just assumed she was incredibly lucky, or that the banks were making administrative errors in her favor. She happily lived beyond her means, fueled by the invisible safety net I provided. Then, in 2019, everything shifted into a higher, more dangerous gear. She started dating Reginald Sterling. Reginald was a junior hedge fund analyst, but his salary didn't matter. He came from the Sterling family, a dynasty that had made their massive fortune in aggressive railroad investments 3 generations ago. They were old money. They owned a sprawling, historic 12-bedroom estate in Greenwich. They drove matching, pristine Range Rovers. They spent their long, lazy summers at their private compound in the Hamptons. Caroline was in absolute heaven. Finally, she felt she had arrived. Finally, she was dating someone with real class, real pedigree, real wealth. The Sterlings, however, looked down their aristocratic noses at me from day one. I was the working-class blemish on their perfect social canvas. At forced, agonizing family dinners, Patricia Sterling, Reginald's mother, would make thinly veiled, passive-aggressive comments about Caroline's modest, working-class background and how incredibly fortunate she was to be joining a family with real heritage. Reginald's father, Whitman Sterling Jr., a man who wore ascots and drank scotch older than Caroline, once cornered me at a lavish Christmas party. He swirled his drink, looked at my off-the-rack suit with barely concealed pity, and told me that he deeply admired how I had done my best with such incredibly limited resources. I had simply smiled, a tight, forced expression, and thanked him for his deep understanding of my difficult situation. But Caroline had absolutely no idea what her mother had really said about her in those final, agonizing weeks in hospice. She didn't know about the dark, desperate conversations Margaret and I had when the morphine stripped away all social niceties and made my dying wife brutally, painfully honest about our daughter's true character. She was about to find out. She was about to learn the hardest lesson of her life. Why you should never, ever assume that the quiet, unassuming person sitting in the back corner doesn't hold the keys to the nuclear option. The wedding was everything Caroline had dreamed of, held at the Ashworth Estate Country Club, a venue that cost $85,000 just for the day. There were 180 guests, a sea of custom tailoring, designer silk, and generational wealth. Men in Brioni suits smoked expensive cigars, while women in Cartier diamonds traded gossip over $200 vintage champagne. I arrived wearing my best suit, a $200 navy blue polyblend from Men's Warehouse. I wore it because Caroline had explicitly instructed me to. She didn't want the Sterlings thinking I was pretending to be something I wasn't. I pressed that old suit, polished my loafers, and walked in looking exactly like the humble, working-class father she wanted. The ceremony was beautiful. Caroline looked radiant in her $15,000 Vera Wang dress. Reginald looked perfect in his custom tuxedo. I walked her down the aisle, feeling the judgmental eyes on my cheap suit, and gave her away. I even smiled when the photographer told me to look proud. I was proud. hoping that beneath her newfound entitlement, the kind girl Margaret had raised was still there. I remained proud until the reception dinner. The Sterlings had seated me at table 12, strategically placed in the darkest back corner, next to the heavy swinging doors of the catering kitchen. My tablemates were Reginald's deaf great-aunt and two miserable distant cousins. Caroline's table was elevated on a dais, decorated with $500 worth of rare white orchids. She sat between Reginald and his father, Whitman, laughing and fitting perfectly into their elite crowd. During cocktail hour, I had overheard Reginald's Princeton buddies debating property taxes on their Martha's Vineyard summer houses, and hedge fund managers comparing vintage Ferraris. One of Reginald's groomsmen asked Caroline how she had managed to escape her unfortunate circumstances. "Good genes from my mother's side and much better taste, I guess," she had replied, laughing. I thought that was the worst of it. I was wrong. The real show started when Caroline stood up to give her speech. She tapped her crystal champagne flute. The room went quiet. "Good evening, everyone," Caroline began, her voice amplified flawlessly. "I want to thank you all for being here on the most important day of my life." Polite applause followed. Growing up, I honestly never thought I'd end up somewhere like this. Married to an amazing man from such an accomplished family, surrounded by all of you successful people. More applause. The Sterlings preened. I took a slow sip of my water. "I have to be honest with you all," Caroline said, letting a heavy pause hang in the air. "My childhood wasn't easy. It wasn't like Reginald's." She turned and looked directly at me. "My father," she started, her voice echoing. "My father tried his best, I suppose, but he never really amounted to anything." The silence in the room turned sharp. A few uncomfortable glances were shot toward my table. "After my mother died," Caroline continued cruelly, "he became, well, let's just say the grief didn't bring out his best qualities. He just gave up on life, on success, on trying to be a provider." I set my water glass down carefully. "I'm not proud to say this," she declared, projecting her voice. "But there were many times when I was deeply embarrassed by him. Embarrassed by his working-class background and the way he settled for absolute mediocrity." At the head table, Whitman Sterling Jr. nodded in approving agreement. "I used to lie awake at night," Caroline whispered theatrically, "wondering what my beautiful mother would think if she could see how far he had fallen. I wondered whether she would be ashamed of the pathetic man she married. I knew she died ashamed of the life he forced her to live." That was the exact moment something cold and unforgiving settled in my chest. Caroline was using Margaret's pristine memory as a crude weapon for social points. But thankfully, Caroline pivoted triumphantly. "I found Reginald. And through him, I found this family, a family that finally showed me what real success looks like. A family that taught me what it means to have ambition." She raised her glass toward the Sterlings. "Whitman, Patricia," she said, her voice dripping with gratitude. "Thank you for welcoming me into your incredible family. Thank you for showing me that it's possible to rise above your unfortunate circumstances. For proving that breeding and class aren't just accidents of birth, but choices you make every single day." Half the room erupted into a roaring standing ovation. "Here's to new beginnings," Caroline shouted over the applause. "Here's to leaving the embarrassing past behind. And to finally having a father figure in Whitman who actually accomplished something worthwhile." She flashed a brilliant smile at Whitman Sterling Jr., who beamed back and raised his glass. "And," Caroline couldn't resist one final twist of the knife, "here's to my real father, sitting all the way over there at table 12, who did his absolute best with what little he had, even if it wasn't very much at all." A few people actually laughed out loud at the pathetic old man in the cheap suit. Caroline raised her glass one last time, her eyes burning with triumph as she stared me down. "To everyone who helped me become the strong woman I am today, and to those who showed me exactly what I absolutely never wanted to become." The room exploded into deafening applause. Caroline hugged Reginald and kissed her new, wealthy father-in-law on the cheek. I sat there in the shadows of table 12. I didn't move. I watched my daughter glow with toxic pride at having publicly humiliated the man who had sacrificed everything for her. Then, very slowly, I reached my hand into my jacket pocket. Caroline had absolutely no idea what I was carrying. She had no idea what I had been safeguarding for 8 long years. What I pulled from my pocket wasn't a weapon. It was my wife's phone. It was the rose gold iPhone 7 Plus Margaret had kept during her final weeks in hospice care. I had meticulously kept it charged for 8 years, unable to delete the very last voice memo she had recorded 3 days before she died. I had listened to it exactly once, until tonight, as the applause faded, I slowly stood up. I walked past the dessert station and the mahogany bar, ignoring the wealthy guests. I found a quiet, dimly lit alcove near the coat check. I unlocked the screen of the rose gold iPhone and navigated to the voice memos app. The file was right there. I took a deep breath and pressed play. Margaret's voice, raspy but fierce, filled the small speaker. "Matt," she began, "if you're listening to this, it means I'm gone. And knowing you, you're probably thinking about playing the silent martyr. Even dying, she knew me better than I knew myself. I need you to know some things about Caroline." The recording continued. "Things I couldn't say while I was alive, because I kept hoping she would grow out of it." I closed my eyes, listening to my dead wife's final confession. "She's become cruel, Matt." Margaret's voice trembled. "Not just selfish, cruel. Last week, when the nurse was helping me to the bathroom, Caroline asked when I was finally going to die, so you could get back to normal life." The words hit me like ice water. Those were her exact words. She told me she was embarrassed to bring friends around because of how pathetic you'd become. She told her dying mother she wished she had been born into a successful family. Margaret's voice got stronger. "I heard her on the phone yesterday, Matt. She was talking to that Sterling boy. She was laughing about how her working-class father would never fit into their world. She said she was grateful she inherited her intelligence from my side, because your genes were clearly limited." I paused the recording, my hands shaking with cold, pure rage. When I pressed play again, Margaret was sobbing. "I'm scared, Matt, not of dying. I'm terrified of what our daughter is becoming. Promise me you won't enable this toxic behavior with our money after I'm gone. Make her earn her character the hard way." Her voice dropped to a desperate whisper. "And Matt, if she ever dishonors my memory to make herself look better, if she ever uses my death as an excuse to hurt you or climb the social ladder, you have my explicit permission to tell her exactly what I thought about the monster she was becoming. Do not hold back." The recording ended abruptly with a timestamp. January 12, 2016. 11:47 p.m. 3 days before she died, I stood in that shadowed corner for 5 minutes. For 8 years, I had honored Margaret's dying wishes. I let Caroline struggle. I let her believe we were broke, hoping she was building character. Instead, she had built resentment, and tonight she had crossed the one uncrossable line Margaret had warned me about. It was time. I walked back into the blazing light of the reception hall, past the crowded dance floor and the Sterling family table. I sat down at table 12 and reached for my own phone. I unlocked the screen and prepared my arsenal. I opened the Chase Bank app. It verified my face and loaded my checking account balance. 33,187,432. I opened the Wells Fargo Wealth Management app, my investment portfolio. 41,9,356. I opened my secure photo vault and brought up my Defense Superior Service Medal. I scrolled to the property deed showing I was the sole owner of the Sterling family estate in Greenwich, bought in 2009 for $3.2 million. I brought up the master spreadsheet, tracking every anonymous payment I had made to Caroline's accounts over the past 8 years, totaling $247. Finally, I checked Margaret's rose gold iPhone, ensuring the voice recording was queued up. Across the room, the DJ's voice boomed over the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, I've just been informed that the father of the bride has requested to make a speech." I hadn't requested anything. But I stood up anyway, because some promises made to the dead are vastly more important than keeping the fragile peace with the living. I didn't walk straight to the podium. That would have been sloppy. Instead, I walked over to the main bar and borrowed a portable phone charger. I plugged in both phones, ensuring they were fully charged and ready. While they powered up, I forwarded myself an email from my estate attorney confirming the final details of a devastating legal decision. I created a new photo album with all 23 pieces of evidence. And finally, I started a brand new voice recording on my own phone. "This is Matt Thompson speaking," I whispered into the microphone. "Today is September 23, 2024. The time is exactly 8:47 p.m. I am of perfectly sound mind and clear, rational judgment. What I am about to do tonight, I do in strict accordance with my late wife's explicit wishes, and in direct response to my daughter's public dishonoring of her mother's memory. I saved the recording and locked it. I used the 10 minutes of the best man's speech to arrange my evidence in exact chronological order. First, Margaret's voice recording. Second, my bank statement. The property deed. Fourth, the master spreadsheet. Fifth, my military credentials. Sixth, the email confirming the changes to my will. The DJ got back on the microphone. And now, we call for the father of the bride. Before I could move, Caroline grabbed a microphone from the head table. Oh, actually, Caroline said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. My father is a little shy about public speaking. He probably won't want to say anything tonight. He's not really comfortable in front of crowds like this. Nervous, mocking laughter rippled through the sterling tables. I stood up and pushed my chair back, the legs scraping loudly against the floor. No, Caroline, I said, projecting my voice across the room without a microphone. I think I do have something to say. The entire room went deathly quiet. 180 people turned to look at the older man in the cheap suit, confidently walking toward the main podium. Caroline's face instantly went pale. For a fleeting moment, she looked exactly like the terrified little girl who used to apologize profusely when she accidentally broke something valuable. But she had broken something far more valuable than a vase tonight, and it was far too late for apologies. I reached the podium, looked out at the massive crowd, and calmly plugged the auxiliary audio cable directly into Margaret's rose gold iPhone. Then, I leaned into the microphone. The wedding reception was about to become a courtroom. And I was the judge, the jury, and the executioner. Good evening, everyone, I said, my voice carrying clearly, echoing off the high ceilings of the reception hall. The venue's sound system was flawless. Every single person in that massive room could hear me perfectly. I didn't need to shout. I spoke with the calm, measured cadence of a man who held all the cards. I paused, letting the heavy, suffocating silence of the room settle in. The tension was palpable, a physical weight pressing down on the guests. I want to sincerely thank you all for being here tonight, I continued, making deliberate eye contact with the head table. To celebrate Caroline and Reginald's wedding, it has been an incredibly educational evening. A few polite, uncertain chuckles broke the silence, coming from the guests who thought I was making a self-deprecating joke. At the head table, however, no one was laughing. Caroline was gripping her fragile crystal champagne flute with such white-knuckled intensity that I genuinely thought the glass might shatter in her hands. Reginald had his hand placed protectively on her bare shoulder, but his expression was one of deep confusion. He couldn't quite figure out why his new impoverished, supposedly beaten-down father-in-law suddenly seemed so utterly calm, so terrifyingly confident in front of a crowd of billionaires. You know, I said, stepping slightly away from the podium so they could see my full posture, I've been sitting back there at table 12 all night. It's a lovely spot right by the kitchen, and I've been listening. I've been listening to all these wonderful speeches. I've been hearing a lot about success and grand accomplishment. I've heard a lot about rising above your unfortunate circumstances, and about the immense pride of joining a family with real breeding, real class, and real heritage. I stopped pacing and looked directly, unblinkingly, at Whitman Sterling Jr. And listening to all of this, I said, my voice dropping an octave, it got me thinking about my late wife. It got me thinking about Margaret. I couldn't help but wonder what she would have thought of tonight's magnificent festivities. Caroline's eyes began darting frantically between me, the microphone, and the heavy exit doors at the back of the hall. The sheer panic was beginning to leak through her meticulously applied makeup. Margaret was a truly wonderful woman, I told the crowd, softening my tone just enough to draw them in. She was a dedicated kindergarten teacher who touched hundreds of young, impressionable lives during her 28 years in the classroom. She believed in kindness, she believed in humility. Sadly, she passed away 8 long years ago, after a brutal, drawn-out battle with breast cancer. A low wave of sympathetic murmurs rippled through the crowd. Several older women in the audience nodded respectfully, their expressions softening with genuine pity for the grieving widower. Now, I continued, my voice hardening slightly, during Margaret's devastating illness, we spent absolutely everything we had trying to save her life. Every last penny. Caroline, my daughter, sat there and watched me write check after massive check to specialists, to hospitals, to experimental clinics. She saw our hard-earned savings completely disappear. She witnessed what she fully believed was her father willingly spending himself into absolute poverty out of desperate, foolish love. I slowly turned my gaze back to Caroline. Her face was ashen, the color of dirty snow. Then after Margaret died, I projected my voice, so it rang clear as a bell. Caroline firmly believed that her father was broke. Destitute. Finished. She believed I was a pathetic failure who had gambled away our entire financial future on medical treatments that simply didn't work. She believed I had given up. More nods from the audience. They were fully engaged now. They were feeling deep sorrow for me, buying completely into the narrative of the tragic widower who had lost his wife and his dignity. For 8 years, I said, pausing for dramatic effect. I let her believe that exact story. The room grew so quiet, I could hear the hum of the air conditioning. I actively let her think that I was struggling financially. I confessed to the silent crowd. I let her believe that I was forced to live in a tiny, cramped apartment, that I was driving a beat-up old car, that I was shopping at discount stores, simply because I had absolutely no other choice. At the head table, Whitman Sterling Jr. leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. He was a ruthless businessman, and his instincts were finally kicking in. He realized that this speech wasn't going anywhere near where he had expected. I let Caroline firmly believe, I said, staring right at her, that she was dating vastly above her station when she met Reginald. I let her believe that she was incredibly, unbelievably lucky to be accepted into a family with real money and true class. I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket and slowly pulled out both phones. I held them up for the crowd to see, but before I continue with my speech, I said, tapping the screen of the rose gold iPhone to wake it up, I think you should all hear something. It's a voice recording. It's a recording that Margaret made exactly 3 days before she died. It is something she explicitly asked me to share with you all. If certain specific circumstances ever arose, Caroline stood up so abruptly her heavy chair scraped violently against the floor, nearly tipping backward. "Dad," she gasped, her voice trembling with barely suppressed terror. "Dad, stop, maybe we should just sit down." "Carolyn," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but the sheer, icy authority in it made her freeze instantly in her tracks. The loving father was gone. The military contractor was speaking now. "You just stood at this very podium," I reminded her, my words clipping through the air like bullets, "and you gave a beautiful, heartfelt speech about how your mother died, deeply ashamed of the mediocre man she married. You spoke eloquently about how grateful you are to have finally found a real father figure in Whitman. You talked about leaving your embarrassing past behind." I held Margaret's phone higher, pointing the bottom speaker toward the microphone. "I think it is only fair," I declared, looking at the stunned faces of the Sterling family, "that every single person in this room hears exactly what your mother actually said about you during her final days on this earth." The silence that followed was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop on the thick carpet. Nobody breathed. The waiters in the back had stopped moving. "This original audio file," I stated for the record, holding up my own phone to show the metadata, "is digitally timestamped January 12, 2016. 3 days before Margaret Thompson died. She recorded this specifically for this exact moment." Caroline's mouth was opening and closing like a fish suffocating on dry land, but no sound was coming out. Her eyes were wide with a primal, inescapable panic. "After you hear your mother's actual words about the daughter she was leaving behind," I promised the crowd, "I have a few other very important things to share with you all. Facts about true success and accomplishment. Facts about class and breeding, and facts about exactly who in this room has really been rising above their circumstances." I reached down and pressed play on the rose gold screen. Margaret's weak, raspy, but fiercely determined voice instantly filled the massive reception hall, booming through the state-of-the-art speakers. "Matt," the dead woman's voice echoed across the orchids and the champagne. "If you're listening to this, it means I'm gone, and Caroline has probably crossed the line I warned you about." 180 people went completely, terrifyingly silent. The collective shock was a physical wave. The nuclear option had officially gone live. Margaret's voice continued, clear, undeniable, and devastating. "She's become cruel, Matt, not just selfish, cruel." The voice cracked with a mother's profound sorrow. "Last week, when the nurse was helping me to the bathroom, Caroline asked when I was finally going to die so you could get back to normal life." Those were her exact words. Loud, audible gasps erupted from multiple tables across the room. Women covered their mouths in absolute horror. Men stared in stunned disbelief. I watched Caroline's face go from a sickly white to a pale, nauseating green. She looked like she was going to be physically sick right there on the head table. She told me, the recording played on, relentless in its truth, that she was embarrassed to bring friends around because of how pathetic you'd become. She said she wished she'd been born into a different family. A successful family. Several wedding guests, including Reginald's own groomsmen, turned their heads to stare directly at Caroline with expressions of pure, unadulterated disgust. Reginald's protective grip on her shoulder tightened into a rigid, defensive claw. Margaret's voice grew stronger, fueled by a dying mother's desperate need to protect her husband. I heard her on the phone with that sterling boy, Matt. She was laughing. She was laughing about how her working-class father would never fit into their world. She said she was grateful. She'd inherited her intelligence from my side of the family. Because your genes were clearly limited. At the head table, Whitman Sterling Jr.'s face darkened into a furious, thunderous scowl. He wasn't staring at me anymore. He was staring dead at Caroline, his eyes blazing with the realization of the absolute monster his son had just legally bound himself to. I'm scared, Matt. Margaret wept through the speakers. Not of dying, but of what she's becoming. Promise me you won't enable this behavior with money after I'm gone. Promise me you'll make her earn her character the hard way. The recording ended. The heavy silence slammed back into the room, louder than a gunshot. I looked out at 180 completely paralyzed faces. That was your mother's dying wish, Caroline, I said, my voice dropping back to a conversational, yet infinitely colder tone. Her final wish was that I not spoil you with unearned wealth. That I let you build actual character through genuine struggle. I picked up my own phone and unlocked it, holding the bright screen up for the room to see. For 8 years, I said, my eyes locking onto hers, I honored that wish to the letter. I let you believe we were entirely broke. I sat back and watched you work for everything you had. I desperately hoped, every single day, that you would develop empathy. That you would develop humility, the exact qualities your mother valued above all else. Caroline finally found her voice. She stepped away from the table, tears streaming down her face, ruining her perfect makeup. Dad, please, I am not finished. My voice cut through her pathetic attempt at an apology like a freshly sharpened blade. She recoiled physically, taking a step back. Instead of developing character, I spat out, the anger finally bleeding into my words. You became exactly what your mother feared the most. You became someone who values superficial wealth over human decency. You became someone so devoid of character that you would publicly dishonor the dead just to gain the fleeting social approval of people who look down on you. I tapped the screen of my phone, opening the Chase Bank application, and held the phone up high enough for the entire front section of the room to read clearly. So I announced to the silent room, let me share a few hard facts with everyone here tonight. Let's talk about real success and true accomplishment. I read the numbers directly from the glowing screen. My current liquid checking account balance, I stated clearly, is $33,187,432. The silence morphed from shock into absolute, staggering disbelief. No one breathed. The only sound was the faint rustle of silk as people shifted uncomfortably in their expensive chairs. My diversified investment portfolio, I continued, swiping to the Wells Fargo app, currently managed by the private wealth division of Goldman Sachs, is worth $41,293,156. At the head table, Whitman Sterling Jr. was gripping his crystal wine glass with such brute force that his knuckles were bone-white. The aristocratic sneer had completely vanished from his face, replaced by the sheer unadulterated terror of a man realizing he was severely outgunned. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a neatly folded stack of printed documents. I held the first one up. This is a certified copy of my military service record, I explained, letting the paper flutter slightly. I held top secret, level 5 security clearance for 15 consecutive years. I worked as a senior Pentagon contractor, specializing in classified cyber defense systems. The final project I designed and completed in 2019 was the largest single contractor award in United States military history. It paid out $47.5 million. Several people seated at the Sterling family table were now actively staring down at their half-eaten plates of filet mignon, completely unwilling to make eye contact with the pathetic working-class failure, who could buy and sell their entire lineage before breakfast. But I said, a cold, humorless smile finally touching my lips, my absolute favorite document is this one. I pulled out the next paper and unfolded it deliberately. This is a verified property deed, I announced, making sure my voice reached the darkest corners of the room. It is the deed for the sprawling historic estate located at 247 Meadowbrook Lane in Greenwich, Connecticut. I paused, letting the address hang in the air. Some of you in this room might intimately recognize that specific address. Whitman Sterling Jr. went completely, horrifyingly pale. It looked as though all the blood had been instantly drained from his body. It is supposedly the Sterling family's grand ancestral home, I continued, my voice dripping with icy condescension. The magnificent 12-bedroom mansion, where they love to brag they have lived for 4 prosperous generations. Except, there's a minor detail they conveniently left out. I turned my head and looked directly into Whitman's terrified eyes. They don't own it. I let the words sink in. I do. Patricia Sterling, Reginald's mother, let out a sharp, strangulated choking sound, bringing a diamond-ringed hand to her throat. I bought it entirely in cash in 2009, I explained to the captivated audience. When your vaunted railroad fortune completely collapsed under the weight of sheer incompetence, and you faced imminent, humiliating public bankruptcy. You have been quietly renting it from me, for exactly $1 a year, under a highly confidential charitable arrangement I personally designed. I set it up specifically to help you save face in front of all these lovely country club friends of yours. The room erupted in a chaotic chorus of gasps, panicked whispers, and shocked exclamations. The facade was completely shattered. The great Sterling dynasty was nothing but smoke and mirrors, funded by the man they had spent the entire evening treating like garbage. The property is currently appraised at $8.2 million. I shouted slightly over the rising noise level. The property taxes, which I pay in full every single year, are $63,000 annually. The structural maintenance, which I also generously cover out of pocket, runs about $40,000 per year. I turned my attention away from the ruined Sterlings and back to my sobbing daughter. Caroline's mascara was running in thick black rivers down her cheeks, staining the pristine white fabric of her incredibly expensive dress. Would you like to know what else I've been quietly paying for, Caroline? I asked her, my tone devoid of any remaining paternal warmth. I pulled out my phone again and opened the master spreadsheet. Your undergraduate student loan payments, I read aloud, funded by anonymous cashier's checks totaling $87,000 over the last 6 years. Your credit card payments, conveniently cleared every time you max them out buying designer bags, totaling $43,000. Your various apartment security deposits and miraculous rent assistance programs, totaling $91,000. The car payments, premium insurance, and routine maintenance for that shiny BMW X5 you love to drive, totaling $26,000. I looked up from the screen, my eyes boring into hers. The total anonymous financial assistance provided to Caroline Thompson over the last 8 years, I announced, is exactly $247,000. The staggering numbers hung in the stale air of the reception hall, like a heavy, inescapable indictment. Every single month, I told her, my voice dropping to a low, furious rasp. I sat back and watched you struggle just enough to firmly believe you were earning your own way in the world. Every single month, I stepped in from the shadows to make sure you never actually failed. And every single month, I desperately hoped you were finally developing the strong character your mother wanted you to have. I paused, looking around the room at the sea of utterly silent, captivated faces. Instead, I said, shaking my head in slow, profound disgust, you stood at this very podium tonight. You looked out at 180 people, and you told them that your mother died ashamed of me. You told them that I was a pathetic, useless failure who never amounted to anything. I leaned closer to the microphone. My voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the devastating force of a hurricane. Your mother didn't die ashamed of me, Caroline. She died terrified of you. Caroline collapsed back into her chair, burying her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. Her shoulders shook violently, with the force of her complete and total breakdown. Beside her, Reginald looked like he wanted the polished hardwood floor to open up and swallow him whole. But I wasn't quite done yet. There was one final piece of business to attend to. I reached into my jacket one last time and pulled out the crisp, legally binding document. This morning, I announced to the silent room. I had an urgent meeting with my estate attorney. This document in my hand is a fully revised, legally binding last will and testament. It was executed, witnessed, and notarized as of 3:30 p.m. this afternoon. I held the thick document high up in the air for everyone to clearly see the blue notary stamps. My previous will, I explained calmly, left absolutely everything I owned to Caroline. My various properties, my extensive investment portfolios, the remaining payouts from my military pensions. Everything. The total estimated value was approximately $74 million. Caroline slowly looked up through her stained, tear-streaked fingers. For a brief, pathetic second, a tiny flicker of desperate hope danced in her bloodshot eyes. She thought I was reminding her of what she still stood to gain. I crushed that hope instantly. My new will, I declared, my voice ringing with finality, leaves Caroline Thompson exactly $1. Ironically, it is the exact same amount her wealthy new in-laws currently pay me in rent. The hope in her eyes died, replaced by a vast hollow emptiness. The magnitude of what she had just lost finally crashed down upon her. The remaining $73.9 million, I concluded, will go entirely to the American Cancer Society, placed in a permanent, irrevocable trust in the loving memory of Margaret Thompson. A woman who valued strong character over superficial wealth and who valued simple kindness over class. I meticulously folded the revised will, making sharp creases in the thick paper, and slid it safely back into my breast pocket. These legal changes, I stated for the record, ensuring the audio recorder caught every word, are designed to take effect immediately upon my verbal authorization, which I am happily giving right now, in front of 180 incredibly well-dressed witnesses. I looked at my daughter one final time. I felt no pity. I felt no regret. I felt nothing but the cold, sterile satisfaction of a mission accomplished. "Congratulations on your beautiful wedding, sweetheart," I said, offering her a chillingly polite smile. "You finally got exactly what you always wanted, a family with real money and real class." I gestured grandly toward the devastated Sterling table, where Whitman Jr. was currently staring down into his wineglass, as if praying it contained lethal poison, and Patricia was weeping into a linen napkin. "Of course," I added, stepping away from the podium. "Now that everyone in Greenwich knows who actually owns their ancestral home, things might be just a little bit awkward for you at Thanksgiving dinner." I calmly reached out, disconnected Margaret's phone from the auxiliary cable, and retrieved both of my devices from the podium. "Enjoy the rest of your beautiful reception, everyone," I said casually to the stunned crowd. "Don't hold back. The open bar is already completely paid for." I turned my back on the head table and walked away from the microphone, leaving the smoldering ruins of my daughter's new life behind me. I made it exactly 15 feet from the microphone before the chaos started. Caroline's scream cut through the stunned silence like a jagged butcher's knife. It was a full-throated, visceral scream of pure anguish that made half the room physically flinch. "You can't do this." She scrambled out from behind the head table, tripping over her $15,000 dress. Her makeup was ruined, mascara streaming down her cheeks in thick black rivers. "You can't just destroy my life like this," she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at me. 30 years I've been your daughter, and you wait until tonight to destroy me in front of everyone I know." I slowly turned back toward her, my posture relaxed, my voice entirely devoid of emotion. 8 years, Caroline," I corrected her calmly. "For 8 years, you willingly let me believe that your mother died deeply ashamed of the man she married." "I never said that," she shrieked. I reached back into my pocket and pulled out Margaret's rose gold iPhone. "Would you like me to connect it to the sound system and play the recording again?" I asked. "I have the exact timestamp queued up where your mother quotes your words." Caroline's mouth opened and closed silently. The lie died on her lips. Reginald finally found his voice. "Now, you wait just a minute," he bellowed, standing up so forcefully his chair crashed backward. His face was a mottled red. "You can't just barge into our wedding and humiliate my new wife with some heavily edited, fabricated recording." "Fabricated?" I asked, opening the voice recording app on my own phone to show the file properties. "This is an original encrypted Apple audio file, timestamped January 12, 2016. It has never been edited. I can gladly provide the metadata to any forensic audio expert your lawyers would like to hire." Reginald's father, Whitman Sterling Jr., finally stood up. His hands were shaking so badly he gripped the tablecloth to steady himself. "The property deed," Whitman stammered, his voice thin, stripped of its arrogance. "That has to be a forgery. Our family has owned that estate since 1924. I opened the official Connecticut State Property Records application on my phone. Would you like me to project the public state records onto the wall, Whitman?" I challenged him. "Property transfers are public record. Your devastating Chapter 11 bankruptcy filing from 2009 is also public record. Should we read the details of your financial incompetence together? Whitman's face went a sickening gray. You son of a, he whispered. Actually, I interrupted smoothly. My mother was a working-class saint. Unlike some people in this room, she actually worked for everything she had. That was when Patricia Sterling completely lost her grip on reality. She didn't just cry. She started wailing, drawing every eye in the room. 40 years, Patricia wailed. 40 years we have been telling everyone in Greenwich about our historic family estate. You've ruined us. Meanwhile, Caroline found a second wind of fury. All those anonymous payments. She screamed, you were spying on me. Stalking my finances for 8 years. I was generously helping you, Caroline, I replied coldly. Keeping a roof over your head and the debt collectors off your back. I didn't ask for your pathetic help. No, I agreed. You just eagerly cashed the anonymous checks and convinced yourself you were a self-made woman. Several wedding guests were now openly taking photos and live streaming the destruction of the Sterling family. One of Reginald's groomsmen, Brandon, was the first to break ranks. Dude, Brandon said loudly, pointing at Reginald, your father-in-law literally owns your house. That is actually hilarious. Shut up, Brandon. Reginald snarled, no, seriously, Brandon continued, filming everything. This is like a premium Netflix documentary playing out in real time. The broke dad who is secretly richer than all of us. That was when the non-Sterling guests at the back tables started to react. A woman at table 6 stood up, smiled, and started clapping. Then, an older gentleman at table 3 joined in. Within 30 seconds, half the room was actively applauding the ultimate underdog victory. The Sterling family members looked utterly mortified, their wealthy friends frantically texting on their phones. Caroline completely lost her composure. Stop clapping. She screamed, this isn't funny. He just maliciously destroyed my entire family. She turned to me, her eyes burning with pure hatred. I hope ruining my life was worth it for you. It was, Caroline, I said perfectly calmly. Your mother made me swear to set boundaries if you ever crossed certain unforgivable lines. Tonight you eagerly sprinted past the biggest one. What line? She demanded, using her sacred memory as a cheap weapon against the man who loved her most. I answered simply. That finally shut her up, the venom drained from her face, leaving only the stark reality of her actions. Reginald was pacing, barking into his cell phone. Whitman had collapsed back into his chair. Patricia was still sobbing. I decided it was time to leave. I turned and walked toward the exit doors, striding past tables full of applauding guests. As I reached the double doors, Caroline's voice rang out one last time. Don't you dare walk away from me. We are not done here. I stopped, turned back, and looked at my daughter in her ruined dress, surrounded by the smoking wreckage of her new family's reputation. Yes, Caroline, I said quietly, we are. I walked out into the cool Connecticut night, leaving behind 8 agonizing years of silence and 33 years of fatherhood. At 11:30 p.m., as I was sitting in my dark living room, my phone rang. The caller ID flashed. Caroline, Dad, she said immediately. Dad, please, we need to talk. I'm sitting in the parking lot of your condo complex. I went downstairs. Caroline was leaning against the sleek black BMW X5 I had been quietly making the payments on. She still wore her torn wedding dress. The reception ended at 9:45, she said, staring at the asphalt. Reginald's parents are already aggressively talking about an annulment. They are claiming I committed blatant fraud. Like being secretly wealthy is something you have to legally warn people about. I noted dryly. She let out a bitter laugh. Reginald is vastly more angry about losing the potential inheritance money than the public humiliation. Turns out, he was desperately marrying up the entire time. She finally looked up, and I saw a fleeting glimpse of Margaret in her eyes. I listened to Mom's voice recording again, she confessed. Reginald's groomsman posted the video. She was right about what I had become. For a brief moment, I felt a flicker of hope, but then her expression hardened. But that doesn't make what you did to me tonight okay, she stated coldly. You viciously humiliated me. You deliberately destroyed my marriage. Do you have any idea what this massive scandal is going to do to my career? By tomorrow morning, everyone in Greenwich will know that my supposedly broke father secretly owns the Sterling estate. Maybe you should have considered that before giving that cruel speech, I told her. I was just trying to fit in with them, she cried out. By maliciously throwing your dead mother's sacred memory under the bus, I stated flatly. We stood in total silence for 30 agonizing seconds. I want you to know that I will never forgive you for this, she said deliberately. I'm going to legally contest the new will. I'm going to prove you are mentally incompetent. The revised will was thoroughly reviewed by 3 senior attorneys and a board-certified psychiatrist this afternoon, I informed her, all of whom will gladly testify under oath that I was completely rational and acting on highly specific, predetermined triggering events. Her face fell. You really thought of everything, didn't you? Your mother and I discussed this exact nightmare scenario extensively before she died, I told her sorrowfully. She silently got back into her luxurious BMW and rolled down the tinted window. You know what the absolute worst part is, Dad? She asked, her voice cracking. I actually loved you. Despite everything, I still loved you. She put the car into drive. But after tonight you are completely dead to me, just like Mom. The BMW disappeared into the dark night. I went back upstairs, made a cup of coffee, and thought about the impossible choice between quietly enabling my daughter's growing cruelty and honoring a dead woman's final wishes. At 12:47 a.m. my phone buzzed with a breaking news alert. Wedding reception revenge goes viral. Entitled Daughter Humiliates Broke Father, discovers he's secret millionaire who owns her new in-law's estate. I turned off my phone and went to bed. Some profound life lessons are simply worth $74 million. 6 months later, I am sitting comfortably in my financial advisor's office, signing the paperwork for the single largest charitable donation in Connecticut cancer research history. $73.9 million is being irrevocably transferred to the American Cancer Society, establishing a permanent research trust in the loving memory of Margaret Thompson. The remaining $100,000 goes to me, more than enough for my quiet life. The social consequences for the Sterling family lasted far longer than the media coverage. Whitman Sterling Jr. lost his country club memberships, and Patricia was asked to step down from her charity boards. Reginald filed for an annulment exactly 37 days after the disastrous wedding, citing fraudulent misrepresentation. Caroline didn't even attempt to contest it. It's hard to argue when the explosive confrontation has over 2.3 million views on YouTube. She quietly moved across the country to Portland, Oregon, taking a mid-level job with a small firm. She changed her social media to strict private mode and has never attempted to contact me again. The Sterling family still lives in my Greenwich house. I haven't bothered to raise their rent from $1 per year. Patricia sent me an apologetic letter 3 months ago, but I threw it in the trash. Some people online argue that my public humiliation of my daughter was exceptionally cruel. Those people never had to sit in the dark and hear Margaret's agonizing voice recording. They never had to watch their own flesh and blood maliciously use their beloved spouse's tragic death as a cheap social climbing tool. I sleep incredibly well at night. The Cancer Research Foundation sends me detailed quarterly reports on how the trust money is being utilized. Last month, they sent me a framed photograph from their latest gala. The banner clearly read, "The Margaret Thompson Memorial Research Wing." Margaret would have absolutely loved that. She always said the best revenge against the cruelty of death was helping other people live. I keep her rose gold iPhone fully charged on my nightstand. Sometimes I sit back and play her happy voice memos. The ones where she's laughing hysterically with a young Caroline after school. She never got to see how that future actually turned out. And honestly, I think that is probably for the best. Sometimes, the quiet, unassuming person sitting in the corner has significantly more power than anyone in the room realizes. And sometimes the most incredibly expensive lessons in life are the only ones truly worth learning.